For 3 months, Eleanor Whitmore had fallen in love with a ghost. Every letter that arrived at her boarding house in Chicago bore the careful handwriting of Thomas Mackenzie, a successful rancher from Colorado who wrote like a poet and loved like a gentleman. His words painted pictures of moonlit evenings on the prairie, of quiet conversations by the fireplace, of a man who understood her dreams of a peaceful life far from the suffocating expectations of Eastern society. My dearest Eleanor, his latest letter had begun, I count the days until we meet, when I can finally speak the words I've only dared write on paper. You have become the light in my solitary world, the promise of tomorrow in my today. Those words had convinced her to sell everything she owned, board a train west, and accept his proposal of marriage to a man she'd never seen. The photograph he'd sent showed a distinguished gentleman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, exactly the sort of man who would write such beautiful letters. Eleanor had traced her finger over that image 100 times, imagining their life together. But the man waiting for her at the mail-order bride reception office in Millbrook, Colorado, was nothing like the poet of her dreams. Thomas Mackenzie stood with his back to her when she entered, his broad shoulders filling out a well-tailored black coat. When he turned at the sound of her arrival, Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. He was devastatingly handsome, in a rugged, dangerous way that had nothing to do with the gentle soul she'd imagined. His dark hair was longer than proper gentlemen wore it, his jaw was shadowed with stubble, and his gray eyes held a wildness that made her pulse race for all the wrong reasons. This was not the sensitive man who had written about wildflowers and sunset prayers. This was a man who looked like he could break hearts as easily as wild horses, who belonged in saloons and gambling halls rather than quiet parlors discussing poetry and philosophy. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and even his voice was different from what she'd expected. Deep, rough-edged, with an authority that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, clutching her carpet bag and fighting the urge to turn around and catch the next train back to Chicago. This couldn't be right. The man she'd fallen in love with through letters couldn't possibly be this intimidating stranger who was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You're not what I expected," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Something flickered in his gray eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. "Neither are you," he replied quietly, and Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and something that might have been hurt. Here she stood in her finest traveling dress, having spent her last coins on a new hat and gloves to make a good impression, only to discover that the man of her dreams was a complete stranger, and apparently she was just as much of a disappointment to him. What Eleanor didn't know was that Thomas Mackenzie was asking himself the same question she was. How could 3 months of perfect understanding through letters have prepared them so poorly for the reality of each other? And more importantly, was it possible that the connection they'd built on paper could survive the shock of meeting in person? Or had they both been in love with people who never really existed? The silence in the mail-order bride reception office stretched between them, like a chasm neither seemed willing to cross. Eleanor clutched her carpet bag tighter, acutely aware that Mr. Henderson, the office clerk, was watching their awkward reunion with undisguised curiosity. This wasn't how these meetings were supposed to go. Usually there were tears of joy, immediate embraces, grateful words about answered prayers and new beginnings. Instead, Thomas Mackenzie stood perfectly still, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made Eleanor want to hide behind her traveling veil. She could practically see him cataloging every difference between her reality and whatever image he'd formed from her letters and the photographs she'd sent months ago. "Perhaps, Mr. Henderson interjected nervously, "you'd like to step outside for some fresh air? The afternoon is quite pleasant, and you'll have privacy to get acquainted." Eleanor wanted to say no, wanted to ask for the next train schedule back to Chicago, but Thomas was already nodding. "That's a fine idea," he said, his voice carefully neutral. He gestured toward the door with one leather-gloved hand. "Miss Whitmore?" She had little choice but to precede him onto the wooden boardwalk that ran along Millbrook's main street. The Colorado air was crisp and clean, nothing like the smoky atmosphere of Chicago, And under different circumstances, Eleanor might have appreciated the dramatic backdrop of mountains rising like purple sentinels against the endless sky. Instead, she felt exposed and foolish. A city woman in her fancy traveling clothes standing next to a man who looked like he'd stepped out of every cautionary tale her mother had ever told her about the wild frontier. "Your letters," Eleanor began, then stopped, unsure how to voice her confusion without sounding accusatory. "What about them?" Thomas asked, leaning against the porch railing with deceptive casualness. Up close, she could see the calluses on his hands, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his clothes fit him like he was more accustomed to physical labor than parlor conversations. "They were different," she said carefully. "Beautiful, actually. Poetic. You wrote about books and music, about finding peace in simple pleasures. You quoted Shakespeare." Something shifted in his expression, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. "And you expected a man who quotes Shakespeare to look different than I do?" "I expected a man who quotes Shakespeare to be—" Eleanor searched for the right word. "Gentler, perhaps. More refined. You look like you've never read a book in your life." The words came out harsher than she'd intended, and she immediately regretted them when she saw Thomas's jaw tighten. But instead of anger, what she saw in his eyes looked suspiciously like hurt. "I see," he said quietly. "And what exactly do I look like to you, Miss Whitmore?" Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I didn't mean to offend you. It's just, the man who wrote those letters seemed so gentle, so thoughtful. You seem—" She gestured helplessly at his imposing presence. "Dangerous." To her surprise, Thomas laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. "Dangerous. Well, I suppose that's honest at least." He straightened, no longer leaning against the railing, and Eleanor was struck again by his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the way he moved with unconscious confidence. "Would it help if I told you I didn't write those letters?" Eleanor's stomach dropped. "What?" "Oh, I signed them," Thomas said, his voice taking on a bitter edge. "Every single one. But I didn't write them. My business partner, James Whitfield, has a way with words that I've never possessed. He thought if I had help expressing myself, I might have better luck finding a suitable wife." The world seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. "You mean all those beautiful words, all those thoughts about books and poetry and quiet evenings?" "Were James's, not mine," Thomas confirmed. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but—" He ran a hand through his dark hair, disturbing its careful styling. "I was lonely, Miss Whitmore. Lonelier than I'd ever imagined possible. And when your letters started arriving, so full of intelligence and warmth and genuine feeling, I convinced myself that maybe it didn't matter who actually put the words on paper, as long as the sentiment behind them was real." Eleanor stared at him, feeling like everything she thought she knew about the past 3 months was crumbling around her. "So you lied to me." "I did," Thomas admitted without attempting to justify or excuse it. "And I'm sorry for that. But I need you to understand something. Every feeling I expressed in those letters, even if I didn't have the words to express them properly myself, was genuine. When you wrote about wanting a quiet life, about feeling trapped by society's expectations, about dreaming of a place where you could be yourself without apology, those things resonated with me in ways I couldn't begin to articulate." "But you had James articulate them for you," Eleanor said, and she could hear the betrayal in her own voice. "Yes," Thomas said simply. "I did." Eleanor turned away from him, staring out at the dusty street where a few townspeople were going about their afternoon business, apparently oblivious to the drama unfolding on the mail-order bride reception porch. She felt like a fool. For 3 months, she'd been falling in love with a fiction, a carefully constructed image designed to win her affections under false pretenses. "Why didn't you just hire an actress?" she asked bitterly. "It would have been more honest than this elaborate charade." "Because I wasn't looking for an actress," Thomas said, and something in his voice made her turn back to face him. "I was looking for a wife. A real wife, with real thoughts and feelings and dreams. Someone who could see past the rough edges and find something worth caring about underneath." "But you didn't trust me enough to let me make that choice honestly," Eleanor pointed out. You decided I couldn't possibly care about the real Thomas Mackenzie, so you invented a false one to trick me into coming here. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than it had been since she'd arrived. You're right. I was a coward, and I cheated you out of the chance to make an informed decision. If you want to get back on that train and return to Chicago, I'll pay for your ticket and give you enough money to get settled again. It's the least I can do after deceiving you. Eleanor studied his face, looking for signs of the gentle poet she'd thought she was going to marry. What she found instead was something more complex. A man who was clearly uncomfortable with emotional conversations, but was forcing himself to have one anyway, who looked like he could handle any physical challenge the frontier could throw at him, but seemed genuinely distressed by the hurt he'd caused her. What are you really like? She asked suddenly, without James's eloquent words, without the carefully constructed image. Who is Thomas Mackenzie? He seemed surprised by the question. I don't know how to answer that. Try, Eleanor said, surprised by her own boldness. I've traveled 1,000 miles to meet a man who doesn't exist. The least you can do is introduce me to the one who does. Thomas was quiet for so long, Eleanor began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were halting, as if he was translating thoughts into speech for the first time. I'm not good with word, he began. Never have been. I think plenty, but most of it stays in my head because I can never figure out how to make it sound right when I say it out loud. I do read, more than you might think looking at me, but I prefer books about practical things. History, agriculture, engineering. I've never read Shakespeare for pleasure. He paused as if gathering courage to continue. I built my ranch from nothing, worked 16-hour days for 5 years to make it profitable. I'm good with horses, good with cattle, good with anything that requires more muscle than conversation. I've never been to the opera, don't know how to dance properly, and the last time I tried to discuss poetry with someone, they looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Eleanor found herself listening with growing fascination. This was more honest than anything James Whitfield had written in those beautiful letters. I'm not romantic in the way James made me seem, Thomas continued. I don't think about moonlight and wildflowers. But I notice when the mountains look different in the morning light. I appreciate when a horse trusts me enough to let me work with it. I find satisfaction in building something solid that will last. He looked directly at her then. And I thought maybe, if I was lucky, I could find a woman who might appreciate those things about me, even if I couldn't dress them up in pretty words. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. Why didn't you just say that in your letters? Why did you think you needed James's help? Because women like you don't usually look twice at men like me, Thomas said with brutal honesty. Beautiful, educated, sophisticated women from good families. They want refinement, culture, romance, not calloused hands and awkward conversation and a man who's more comfortable in a barn than a parlor. The simple directness of his words hit Eleanor harder than any of James's flowery prose ever had. She saw now what Thomas couldn't see about himself, that his honesty was more attractive than any amount of borrowed eloquence, that his genuine awkwardness was more endearing than practiced charm. Thomas, she said, and his name felt different on her tongue now that she was speaking to the real man instead of the fictional one. What if you're wrong? What if what I was really responding to in those letters wasn't the poetry, but the sincerity behind it? What if I came here not because I fell in love with James's words, but because I fell in love with the heart that was trying so hard to express itself through them? For the first time since she'd arrived, Thomas Mackenzie smiled. Really smiled, not the careful, polite expression he'd been wearing. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger and far less intimidating. Are you saying you might be willing to give the real me a chance, Miss Whitmore? He asked, and Eleanor could hear hope creeping into his voice despite his obvious efforts to contain it. Eleanor looked at this man who had deceived her, but was now offering her complete honesty, who was rough around the edges, but was trying so hard to do right by her. Maybe the connection she'd felt through those letters hadn't been entirely false after all. Maybe it was possible to build something real from the ashes of their mutual disappointment. I'm saying, Eleanor replied, surprising herself with her own boldness, that I'd like to get to know Thomas Mackenzie, the real one, And maybe you'd like to get to know the real Eleanor Whitmore, too. The walk through Millbrook's dusty streets felt different now that Eleanor knew she was walking beside the real Thomas Mackenzie instead of the phantom poet from her letters. He moved with purposeful strides that spoke of a man accustomed to having places to be and things to accomplish. But he kept glancing at her as if checking to make sure she was still there, still willing to give this impossible situation a chance. "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, lifting her skirt slightly to avoid the worst of the dust that seemed to coat everything in this frontier town. "My ranch is about 3 miles outside of town," Thomas said, then seemed to realize how that might sound to a proper Eastern lady. "I thought, that is, if you're comfortable with it, you could see the place before you decide whether to stay or catch the next train back to civilization." The hesitancy in his voice was so different from the confident authority she'd heard when he'd first spoken to her in the office. This uncertainty, this obvious desire for her approval, was somehow more endearing than all of James Whitfield's carefully crafted romantic declarations. "I'd like that," Eleanor said, and was rewarded with another of those genuine smiles that transformed Thomas's entire face. He helped her up into a sturdy wagon that had clearly been scrubbed clean for the occasion, though no amount of cleaning could disguise its purely functional nature. This wasn't a gentleman's carriage designed for leisurely drives in the park. This was a working man's vehicle, built for hauling supplies and weathering hard use. As they drove away from town, the vast openness of the Colorado landscape stretched out around them in every direction. Eleanor had thought she was prepared for the West after seeing illustrations in books and magazines, but the reality was overwhelming. The sky seemed impossibly huge, an endless dome of blue that made her feel simultaneously insignificant and strangely liberated. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Thomas glanced at her with surprise. "Really? Most women from back east find it harsh, empty, uncivilized." "It's all of those things," Eleanor agreed, "but there's something magnificent about it too. All this space to breathe, to think, to be yourself without worrying about what the neighbors might say." She looked at him curiously. "Is that why you came here? To escape the expectations of civilization?" "Partly," Thomas admitted. "After the war, I couldn't seem to fit back into the life everyone expected me to resume. The idea of sitting behind a desk in some office, making polite conversation at dinner parties, pretending that everything was fine when I could still hear cannon fire in my dreams. It felt like a kind of death." This was the most personal thing he'd shared with her, and Eleanor could hear the cost of that honesty in his carefully controlled voice. "You fought in the war?" 3 years with the Union cavalry," Thomas said. "Saw more than any man should have to see. Did things I'm not proud of because they needed doing. When it was over, I took my discharge pay and headed west. Figured out here a man could start over, build something new instead of trying to pretend the old world still made sense." Eleanor nodded slowly, beginning to understand some of the shadows she glimpsed in his gray eyes. "And did you start over?" "I built the ranch," Thomas said. "Made it profitable, earned the respect of my neighbors, created something solid and lasting. But starting over." He was quiet for a moment. "You can't really start over, Miss Whitmore. You can only decide what to do with who you've become." The honesty of his words struck Eleanor deeply. In her letters, she'd written about wanting to escape the suffocating expectations of her life in Chicago, but she'd never really examined what she was running from or what she hoped to find. "What about you?" Thomas asked. "What made a refined lady from Chicago decide to answer a stranger's advertisement for a wife?" Eleanor considered lying, giving him the sanitized version of her story that she'd rehearsed during the long train ride west. But Thomas had offered her painful honesty about his war experiences and his deception with the letters. She owed him the same. "Because I was dying," she said quietly. "Not literally, but slowly, piece by piece. My father died 2 years ago, leaving debts that ate up most of what little we had. My mother remarried within 6 months to a man who made it clear that my continued presence in his house was an unwelcome burden. I was facing the choice between becoming a governess to some wealthy family's spoiled children or accepting a marriage proposal from Mr. Cornelius Hartwell, a man 3 times my age who collected young wives the way other men collect hunting trophies." Thomas's hands tightened on the reins, but he said nothing, letting her continue. Your letters arrived just as I was beginning to think those were my only options, Eleanor continued. The man who wrote them seemed to offer something I'd never dared hope for. A partnership instead of a prison sentence. A chance to be valued for my thoughts and dreams instead of just my ability to produce heirs or manage a household. And instead, you got a roughneck rancher who can't string two romantic sentences together, Thomas said with self-deprecating humor. No, Eleanor said, surprising them both with her vehemence. Instead, I got a man who's honest about his limitations, who built something worthwhile with his own hands, who treats me like I have a brain in my head instead of just a pretty face to ornament his drawing room. Thomas turned to stare at her so intently that the wagon drifted slightly off the rutted road before he caught himself and corrected their course. You think I'm honest? More honest than any man I've ever met, Eleanor said. Yes, you deceived me about the letters, but when I confronted you, you didn't make excuses or try to justify it. You told me the truth, even though it made you look bad. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Something in Thomas's expression shifted, a walls coming down look that made Eleanor's heart skip unexpectedly. Most people see honesty as a character flaw out here. They say I'm too blunt, too direct, that I don't know how to play the social games that make life pleasant. Maybe, Eleanor said. I'm tired of social games. They were approaching the ranch now, and Eleanor could see Thomas watching her face anxiously as he waited for her reaction to his life's work. The main house was modest but well built, a sturdy wooden structure that looked like it could weather any storm the frontier might throw at it. The barn was larger and newer, clearly where Thomas had invested most of his resources. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures that stretched toward the mountains, and she could see several horses in a corral near the barn. It's not fancy, Thomas said almost apologetically. No crystal chandeliers or marble staircases like you're probably used to. It's perfect, Eleanor said, and realized she meant it. There was something deeply appealing about the clean lines and practical beauty of what Thomas had built. This was a home designed for living, not for impressing visitors. Show me everything. The pride that lit up Thomas's face at her words was worth more than any of James Whitfield's flowery compliments had ever been. He helped her down from the wagon with careful courtesy, and Eleanor was acutely aware of the strength in his hands, the way he made sure she was steady before releasing her. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions, to the horses who clearly adored Thomas and responded to his quiet commands with eager cooperation, to the cattle who seemed less interested in visitors, but grazed peacefully in their well-maintained pastures, to the hired hands who treated Thomas with obvious respect, and Eleanor with curious but polite attention. Boss never mentioned he was expecting company, she heard one of the men murmur to another as they walked toward the house. That's Miss Whitmore, Thomas said, and Eleanor caught the note of pride in his voice that made her cheeks warm. She's considering becoming Mrs. Mackenzie. If I can convince her I'm worth the risk. The casual way he said it, without flowery romantic declarations, but with obvious sincerity, affected Eleanor more than any grand gesture could have. This was a man who didn't waste words on things he didn't mean, which made the words he did choose that much more precious. As they reached the front porch of the house, Thomas turned to her with an expression that was both hopeful and vulnerable. Well, what do you think? Could you see yourself being happy here? Or are you ready for me to drive you back to town for that eastbound train? Eleanor looked around at the ranch Thomas had built with his own hands, at the mountains rising majestically in the distance, at the endless sky that promised freedom from all the petty constraints of her old life. But most of all, she looked at Thomas himself, this honest, hard-working man who was offering her a real partnership instead of pretty lies. I think, she said slowly, that I'd like to stay for supper if you're willing to have me. I want to hear more about your life here, and I want you to know more about who I really am when I'm not trying to impress anyone. The smile that spread across Thomas's face was worth traveling 1,000 miles to see. I'd like that very much, Miss Whitmore. I'd like that more than I can properly say. And as he opened the door to welcome her into his home, Eleanor realized that sometimes the best love stories began not with passionate declarations or romantic gestures, but with two honest people deciding to see each other clearly and finding something beautiful in what they discovered. The interior of Thomas's house was as honest and straightforward as the man himself. No unnecessary frills or decorative flourishes, but everything was clean, well-maintained, and built to last. Eleanor ran her fingers along the smooth wooden surface of a table that had clearly been crafted by hand, noting the careful attention to detail in the joinery. "You made this," she said, and it wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, looking pleased that she'd noticed. "Winter project a few years back. Had to do something with my hands during the months when ranch work slows down." He paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "Also couldn't afford to buy furniture that would survive the trip from Denver." Eleanor smiled at his practical reasoning. "It's beautiful work. Much more substantial than the fancy pieces my mother was so proud of back in Chicago." "Your mother sounds like she valued appearance over function," Thomas observed, moving toward what she assumed was the kitchen. "She valued what other people thought," Eleanor corrected, following him. "Which amounts to the same thing, I suppose. Everything in our house was chosen for how it would look to visitors, not for how well it served the people who actually lived there." The kitchen was the heart of the house, dominated by a large cast-iron stove that radiated warmth throughout the space. Copper pots hung from hooks along one wall, and she could see through the window to a small garden where late-season vegetables still clung to their plants despite the approaching autumn chill. "I'm not much of a cook," Thomas admitted, opening the pantry to survey his options. "Usually just fix simple things. Eggs, bacon, bread, nothing fancy enough for a lady's supper." "I'm not much of a lady," Eleanor replied, beginning to remove her traveling gloves. "At least not the kind who expects to be waited on hand and foot. In Chicago, I did most of the cooking after Father died. Mother considered it beneath her station, but we couldn't afford hired help." Thomas turned to look at her with surprise. "You know how to cook?" "I know how to make a meal from whatever's available," Eleanor said, "which seems more useful than knowing which fork to use for the fish course. Don't you think?" The relief on Thomas's face was almost comical. "I was worried you might expect the kind of elaborate meals James described in his letters. He made it sound like I regularly dined on 7-course affairs with crystal and china." Eleanor laughed, and the sound seemed to surprise them both with its genuine warmth. "James has quite an imagination. What do you actually eat for supper?" "Whatever's practical," Thomas said. "Tonight I was planning on fried ham, eggs from the chickens, biscuits if I felt ambitious." "That sounds perfect," Eleanor said, and meant it. "But let me help. It seems only fair since I'm the unexpected guest." They worked together in the kitchen with an ease that surprised them both. Eleanor had expected awkwardness, the careful politeness of strangers trying not to step on each other's toes. Instead, she found herself moving around Thomas with natural efficiency, as if they'd been cooking together for months instead of meeting for the first time just hours ago. "Pass me that bowl," she said, and Thomas handed it to her before she'd finished asking. When he reached for the salt, she was already sliding it across the counter toward his hand. It was a small thing, but somehow significant. This wordless cooperation that spoke of compatibility on a level deeper than romantic poetry. "You're different than I expected," Thomas said as they sat down to eat at his handmade table. "Different how?" Eleanor asked, serving herself from the simple but well-prepared meal they'd created together. "Easier," Thomas said, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "I don't mean easy in the improper sense. I mean comfortable, natural, like you belong here instead of just visiting from another world." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Maybe because I feel like I do belong here. More than I ever belonged in my mother's parlor, pretending to be fascinated by gossip about people I barely knew." "What did you do with your time in Chicago?" Thomas asked. "Besides cooking and managing the household finances, I mean." Eleanor hesitated, then decided to trust him with the truth. "I read everything I could get my hands on. History, philosophy, even some scientific journals when I could find them. Mother thought it was unnatural for a woman to be so interested in learning, but it was the only thing that kept me from going mad with boredom." Thomas set down his fork and stared at her. "You read scientific journals?" "When I could find them," Eleanor admitted. "There was a lending library near the boarding house where we lived after Father died. The librarian was kind enough to let me borrow books that were supposedly meant for university students. What kind of scientific journals? Thomas pressed, and Eleanor could see genuine interest in his eyes, not the patronizing amusement she'd grown accustomed to from men who thought a woman's intellectual curiosity was a charming quirk to be indulged. Agricultural science mostly, she said. Soil management, crop rotation, breeding techniques for livestock. I found it fascinating how much thought and planning went into successful farming. She looked around at his well-organized kitchen, at the view of his thriving ranch through the window. I suppose that seems irrelevant now, but I genuinely enjoyed learning about it. Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Eleanor, do you have any idea how much those journals cost? Or how hard they are to find outside of agricultural colleges? I know they were expensive, she said. The librarian mentioned that the subscription was a gift from a patron who thought knowledge should be available to anyone willing to seek it out. And you actually understood what you were reading? The technical terminology, the scientific principles? Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. Are you testing me to see if I'm lying about my interests? No, Thomas said quickly. I'm trying to understand how I got so lucky. At her confused expression, he continued, Eleanor, I've been struggling with soil drainage problems in my north pasture for 2 years. I've tried everything I can think of, consulted with other ranchers, even wrote to the Agricultural Extension Office in Denver. What would you recommend for clay soil that retains too much water but still needs to support grazing? Eleanor blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift from personal conversation to technical consultation. Well, that would depend on the slope of the land and the existing drainage patterns, but generally speaking, she found herself warming to the subject, explaining the principles of drainage systems and soil amendment techniques she'd read about in those precious journals. Thomas listened with the focused attention of a man who understood that good advice was worth its weight in gold, asking intelligent follow-up questions and nodding when her suggestions aligned with his own observations. When she finished, he was looking at her with something approaching awe. James's letters never mentioned that you were brilliant, he said simply. I'm not brilliant, Eleanor protested. I just like to learn things. Same thing, in my experience, Thomas said. Eleanor, do you understand what you've just described to me? A drainage system that could reclaim 20 acres of pasture land and increase my carrying capacity by nearly 30%. If your suggestions work, they could add significant value to this ranch. If they work, Eleanor said cautiously, I've never actually implemented any of these techniques myself. I've only read about them. But you understood the principles well enough to adapt them to a specific situation you've never seen before, Thomas pointed out. That's not just book learning, Eleanor. That's genuine understanding. The admiration in his voice made Eleanor feel something she'd never experienced before. The intoxicating sensation of being valued for her mind rather than tolerated despite it. In Chicago, her intellectual interests had been seen as obstacles to overcome, character flaws that made her less marriageable. Here, sitting in Thomas Mackenzie's kitchen, they were assets that could contribute to their shared future. You really think my ideas might work? She asked. I think your ideas are exactly what I've been looking for, Thomas said, and something in his tone suggested he wasn't talking only about drainage systems. Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. She nodded, waiting. If you stayed here, if we went through with this marriage, would you want to be a real partner in running this ranch? Not just keeping house and having babies, though I hope we'd have children eventually, but actually participating in the decisions that affect our livelihood? Eleanor's heart began beating faster. You would want that? A wife who had opinions about business matters? I would want a wife who could help me make better decisions, Thomas said. Someone who could see problems I might miss, suggest solutions I might not think of. Someone who would be as invested in our success as I am, because it would be our success, not just mine. The picture he was painting, a true partnership, a marriage of minds as well as hearts, was so different from anything Eleanor had ever imagined possible that she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I would want that very much. Thomas reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The contact was warm and strong and somehow both comforting and exciting at the same time. Then stay, Eleanor. Not because you have nowhere else to go, not because it's practical, but because we could build something together that's better than anything either of us could create alone. Looking into his honest gray eyes, feeling the callous strength of his hand over hers, Eleanor realized that she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Not the romantic fantasy from those borrowed letters, but something real and solid and infinitely more valuable. A man who saw her clearly and wanted her exactly as she was. "All right, Thomas Mackenzie," she said, turning her hand palm up to clasp his fingers in return. "Let's build something together." Eleanor woke the next morning in Thomas's guest bedroom to the sound of activity in the kitchen below. She'd insisted on staying at the boarding house in town overnight. Propriety demanded it, even on the frontier. But Thomas had convinced her to return to the ranch early to help him with what he called an experiment in drainage theory. She dressed quickly in her simplest traveling dress, one that could withstand getting dirty, and made her way downstairs to find Thomas already brewing coffee and frying eggs with the efficient movements of a man accustomed to caring for himself. "Morning," he said, glancing up with a smile that made her stomach flutter unexpectedly. "Ready to get your hands dirty in the name of agricultural science?" "More ready than I've ever been for anything," Eleanor replied, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. The simple domesticity of the scene, sharing breakfast, planning their day together, felt more intimate than any of the romantic gestures James Whitfield had described in his letters. After breakfast, Thomas led her to the problematic north pasture, where standing water from recent rains had turned portions of the field into a muddy mess. Eleanor walked the perimeter, studying the lay of the land with the focused attention she'd once applied to her scientific journals. "The water's collecting here because there's a natural depression," she observed, kneeling to examine the soil composition. "But if we dig a series of drainage ditches at an angle, we could redirect the flow toward that lower area near the creek." Thomas crouched beside her, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to cling to his clothes. "Show me," he said. For the next hour, Eleanor found herself in the unprecedented position of being the teacher, while a strong, intelligent man listened to her with complete attention. She explained gradient calculations and water table theory, while Thomas took notes in a practical, leather-bound book, asking questions that proved he understood not just her specific suggestions, but the underlying principles. "We'll need to hire extra hands for the digging," Thomas said when she finished outlining her plan. "But if this works, it'll pay for itself within a year through increased grazing capacity." Eleanor felt a thrill of pride and anticipation. "You're really going to try it?" "I'm going to try everything you suggest," Thomas said, and the faith in his voice made her heart race. "Eleanor, I meant what I said last night about partnership. I want your input on every aspect of this operation, not just the problems I can't solve myself." The way he was looking at her, with respect and genuine interest, made Eleanor feel more valued than she ever had in her entire life. "What else would you like to discuss?" "Come with me," Thomas said, offering his hand to help her to her feet. The brief contact of his fingers closing around hers sent warmth shooting through her entire body, and she noticed that he held on just a moment longer than strictly necessary. They spent the morning touring the entire ranch, while Thomas explained his operation with the thorough attention to detail of a man who understood that his future wife needed to know every aspect of their shared business. Eleanor found herself fascinated by the complexity of decisions required to run a successful cattle operation. When to sell, which animals to keep for breeding, how to balance immediate profits with long-term sustainability. "You really built all of this yourself?" she asked as they paused to watch a herd of cattle grazing peacefully in one of the better-maintained pastures. "With help from hired hands during busy seasons," Thomas said. "But yes, I planned every fence line, selected every breeding animal, negotiated every contract." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "It's been lonely work, making all those decisions by myself. I'm looking forward to having someone to discuss things with, someone whose judgment I trust." The simple honesty of his words made Eleanor's chest tight with emotion. "You trust my judgment? Already? You spotted a solution to a problem that's been costing me money for 2 years," Thomas pointed out, And you did it in less time than it took me to finish my morning coffee. Yes, Eleanor, I trust your judgment. They were standing close together at the fence rail, and Eleanor became acutely aware of Thomas's physical presence beside her. He was so much larger than she was, his shoulders broad enough to block the sun, his hands strong and capable as they rested on the wooden fence. But instead of feeling intimidated by his size and strength, she felt protected, cherished in a way that had nothing to do with helpless femininity and everything to do with being valued as a person. Thomas, she said quietly, I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how you'll react. He turned to face her fully, giving her his complete attention. Tell me. Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her courage. The truth is, I didn't just come west to escape a bad situation in Chicago. I came because I was hoping to find something I'd never had before. A man who would see me as an equal partner instead of a decorative accessory or a broodmare for producing heirs. And, Thomas prompted when she hesitated, and I think I've found that with you, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. The way you listen to my ideas, the way you're willing to implement my suggestions, the way you talk about our future as something we'll build together, it's everything I dreamed of, but never thought was possible. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. Eleanor, I need you to understand something. I'm not offering you partnership just because I think it's the modern thing to do, or because I want to seem progressive. I'm offering it because I think you're brilliant, and I'd be a fool not to take advantage of having a brilliant partner. The word brilliant, spoken in his deep voice, made Eleanor feel things she'd never experienced before, a heady combination of intellectual pride and feminine awareness that left her slightly breathless. I'm not brilliant, she protested weakly. You are, Thomas said firmly. And what's more, you're brave enough to use your intelligence instead of hiding it to make other people comfortable. Do you know how rare that is? Before Eleanor could respond, Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Are you willing to marry me not because it's practical or convenient, but because you think we could be happy together? Because you think we could build something that would make both of us better than we are separately? The question hung between them in the crisp morning air. Eleanor looked into Thomas's honest gray eyes and realized that somewhere between his awkward confession about the letters and this moment of perfect understanding, she had started falling in love with him. Not the romantic infatuation she'd felt for James Whitfield's borrowed words, but something deeper and more real, genuine affection and respect for the man Thomas Mackenzie actually was. Yes, she said simply, I think we could be very happy together. Thomas's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Then will you marry me, Eleanor Whitmore? Will you be my wife and my partner and help me turn this ranch into something we can both be proud of? Yes, Thomas Mackenzie, Eleanor said, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. I will marry you, and I will be the best partner you could ask for. When Thomas bent his head to kiss her, Eleanor felt like every disappointing experience in her past had led her to this perfect moment. His lips were warm and careful against hers, asking rather than demanding, and she found herself kissing him back with a passion that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. I should probably mention that I've never been married before, he said with characteristic honesty. I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing. Eleanor laughed, feeling giddy with happiness and possibility. Neither am I, but I think we'll figure it out together. Together, Thomas agreed, and the words sounded like a promise that would last a lifetime. As they walked back toward the house hand in hand, Eleanor realized that she'd found something infinitely more valuable than the romantic fantasy she'd come west seeking. She'd found a real man who saw her clearly, valued her completely, and wanted to build a future based on mutual respect and genuine affection. It wasn't the love story she'd imagined, but it was so much better than anything she could have dreamed. And as Thomas squeezed her hand gently, she knew that their best adventures were just beginning. News of Thomas Mackenzie's engagement to the mail-order bride from Chicago spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire in dry grass. By the time Eleanor returned to town that afternoon to collect her belongings from the boarding house, she could feel curious eyes following her every move down Main Street. "Miss Whitmore," called Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife and undisputed social authority of Millbrook, intercepting Eleanor before she could reach the boarding house steps. "I do hope you'll allow me to welcome you properly to our little community." Eleanor recognized the tone, honeyed politeness wrapped around a core of steel. She'd heard it often enough from Chicago society matrons to know she was about to be interrogated under the guise of neighborly interest. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Patterson," Eleanor replied with equal sweetness. "I understand congratulations are in order," Mrs. Patterson continued, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Eleanor's appearance. "Thomas Mackenzie is quite the catch. Such a successful ranch, and so very—" She paused delicately. "Masculine. Quite different from the sort of gentleman you must be accustomed to back east." The implication was clear. Eleanor was either very fortunate or very desperate to settle for a rough frontiersman. "Mr. Mackenzie is exactly the sort of gentleman I was hoping to find," Eleanor replied calmly. "Honest, hardworking, and intelligent. All the qualities that matter in a husband." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. "How refreshingly practical of you, dear. And how quickly you've made your decision. Why, you only arrived yesterday, didn't you? Some might say it's rather hasty." "Some might say that when you recognize genuine compatibility, there's no point in wasting time on unnecessary delays," Eleanor countered, her smile never wavering. The older woman studied her for a moment, clearly reassessing her initial impression. "Well," she said finally, "Thomas certainly seems animated since your arrival. I don't believe I've ever seen him smile so much in public." "Perhaps he simply needed something to smile about," Eleanor suggested. "Indeed." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "You know, my dear, a successful marriage in a place like this requires more than just personal compatibility. A rancher's wife needs to understand the community, the social obligations, the delicate balance of relationships that keeps everything running smoothly." Eleanor recognized the olive branch for what it was. "I would very much appreciate any guidance you could offer, Mrs. Patterson. I want to be an asset to both my husband and the community." "Splendid," Mrs. Patterson said, looking genuinely pleased. "Then you must allow me to host a small tea party in your honor. Nothing elaborate, just a few of the other ladies so you can become properly acquainted before the wedding." As Eleanor accepted the invitation and listened to Mrs. Patterson's plans, she caught sight of a familiar figure approaching from the direction of the saloon. James Whitfield walked with the confident stride of a man who believed his charm opened every door, his clothes more fashionable than practical, his smile practiced and automatic. "Ladies," he said, tipping his hat with theatrical flourish, "what a delightful picture you make on this lovely afternoon." Mrs. Patterson preened slightly at the compliment, but Eleanor felt an immediate wariness. This was the man whose eloquent words had initially drawn her west, but seeing him now, she wondered how she'd ever been fooled by his polished facade. "Mr. Whitfield," Mrs. Patterson said warmly, "you must meet Miss Whitmore, Thomas's intended bride. Miss Whitmore, this is James Whitfield, Thomas's business partner and one of our most cultured gentlemen." "Miss Whitmore," James said, taking her hand and holding it longer than proper. "The pleasure is entirely mine. Thomas is a lucky man indeed." Eleanor extracted her hand politely but firmly. "Mr. Whitfield, I believe I owe you a debt of gratitude for your assistance with Thomas's correspondence." Something flickered in James's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that Thomas had confessed the deception so readily. "Ah, he told you about that, did he? I hope you weren't too disappointed to discover that your poetic suitor needed a bit of help with romantic expression." "On the contrary," Eleanor said evenly, "I was relieved to learn that the man I'm marrying values honesty over artifice. It speaks well of his character that he chose to tell me the truth, rather than maintain a flattering deception." James's practiced smile faltered slightly. "Of course, though I must say, it seems rather sudden, this engagement. You've known each other less than 48 hours. Long enough to recognize that we're well suited, Eleanor replied, her tone cooling. Sometimes the heart knows what the mind takes longer to accept. How poetic, James said, but there was an edge to his voice now. I do hope Thomas has been forthcoming about all aspects of ranch life. The isolation, the physical demands, the social limitations. It's quite different from Chicago society. Eleanor felt Mrs. Patterson stiffen beside her and realized that James's comments were bordering on inappropriate, questioning Thomas's suitability as a husband in front of the town social leader. Mr. Whitfield, she said quietly but clearly, I came west specifically to escape the meaningless social obligations and artificial constraints of Chicago society. The idea of being useful, of contributing to something real and lasting, is exactly what I was hoping to find. Thomas has offered me a genuine partnership, which is more than most women can expect from marriage. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable, and Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. Well said, my dear. Thomas Mackenzie is one of our most respected citizens, and any woman would be fortunate to win his regard. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Naturally. I meant no disrespect. I simply want to ensure that Miss Whitmore understands what she's committing to. I understand perfectly, Eleanor said. I'm committing to a life with a man who sees me as an equal partner, values my intelligence, and wants to build something meaningful together. What more could any reasonable woman want? The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Thomas rode up Main Street with two of his ranch hands, dust swirling around their mounts' hooves. When he spotted Eleanor, his entire face transformed with genuine pleasure, the kind of unguarded joy that couldn't be faked or practiced. He dismounted and approached their little group, his attention focused entirely on Eleanor, despite the presence of the other two. How did your errands go, he asked, and the simple question carried such warmth and genuine interest that Eleanor felt her heart skip. Very well, she replied, acutely aware of how different this felt from James's polished flirtation. Thomas's interest in her activities was real, not performative. Mrs. Patterson has kindly offered to host a tea so I can meet more of the ladies in town. That's generous of you, ma'am, Thomas said, turning to acknowledge Mrs. Patterson with respectful courtesy. Eleanor's anxious to become part of the community. And we're delighted to welcome her, Mrs. Patterson replied warmly. It's clear she'll be a wonderful addition to Millbrook. James cleared his throat. Thomas, I was just telling Miss Whitmore how, quickly, everything has developed. Perhaps we should discuss the business implications of your marriage. There are arrangements to consider, legal matters to address. Thomas's expression cooled as he looked at his business partner. What arrangements would those be, James? Well, property rights for one thing. Your ranch is currently half owned by our partnership. If you're taking a wife, we should clarify how that affects our agreement. Eleanor saw Thomas's hands clench slightly, but his voice remained level. My personal life doesn't affect our business arrangement, James. The partnership agreement was clear about that when we signed it. Of course, James said smoothly. I simply want to protect everyone's interests, including Miss Whitmore's, naturally. She should understand exactly what assets she'll be entitled to as your wife. The implication was unmistakable, that Eleanor might be marrying Thomas for financial security rather than genuine affection. Eleanor felt her temper flare, but before she could respond, Thomas stepped closer to her, his presence protective and unmistakably possessive. Eleanor doesn't need to understand anything except that she'll be my wife and equal partner in everything I own, Thomas said, his voice carrying a warning. If you have concerns about our business arrangement, we can discuss them privately. But don't insult my fiancée by suggesting she has mercenary motives. The tension between the two men was palpable, and Eleanor realized there were undercurrents to their partnership that she didn't fully understand. But Thomas's defense of her, his immediate assumption that her motives were pure, touched her deeply. Gentlemen, Mrs. Patterson interjected smoothly, perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue for business discussions. Miss Whitmore, shall we finalize the arrangements for Saturday's tea? As they concluded their plans, Eleanor noticed James watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was something calculating in his gaze, as if he were reassessing her potential threat to whatever plans he'd made for Thomas's future. When Mrs. Patterson finally took her leave and James departed with a curt nod, Thomas turned to Eleanor with concern clear in his gray eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked. "James can be intense when it comes to business matters." "I'm fine," Eleanor assured him. "But Thomas, is there something I should know about your partnership with him? Something that might complicate our marriage?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much to tell her. "James invested money in the ranch when I was starting out," he said finally, "in exchange for a percentage of the profits. It's been a good arrangement, but lately he's been pushing for changes I don't agree with. Nothing that affects you and me, but it might make things awkward occasionally." Eleanor nodded, understanding more than Thomas was saying. "Well then, it's fortunate that I don't intimidate easily, and that I have complete faith in your judgment about both business and personal matters." Thomas's smile was worth all the subtle threats and social maneuvering she'd endured that afternoon. "Have I mentioned lately that I'm marrying the most remarkable woman in Colorado territory?" "Not since this morning," Eleanor replied with mock severity. "You're falling down on your husbandly duties already." As Thomas laughed and offered his arm to escort her to the boarding house, Eleanor realized that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And that partnership, that absolute trust and mutual support, was worth more than all the pretty words in the world. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline Colorado sunshine that made everything look newly minted. Eleanor stood before the mirror in her room at the boarding house, adjusting the simple blue dress she'd chosen for the ceremony. It wasn't the elaborate wedding gown she'd once dreamed of, but it was practical and beautiful, much like the marriage she was about to enter. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on helping her prepare, arriving early with a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers and a pearl necklace that had belonged to her own grandmother. "Something borrowed," she'd said with uncharacteristic warmth, "and something that connects you to the women who've made lives here before you." The gesture had moved Eleanor more than she'd expected. In just 1 week, she'd found more genuine acceptance in Millbrook than she'd experienced in years of Chicago society. "Are you nervous, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked as she fastened the pearls around Eleanor's neck. "Excited," Eleanor corrected. "I feel like my real life is finally beginning." The church was fuller than Eleanor had anticipated when Thomas escorted her down the aisle. It seemed like half the territory had turned out to witness the marriage of the successful rancher to his mail-order bride. But Eleanor only had eyes for Thomas, handsome in his best suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion, his gray eyes holding promises she knew he would keep. Reverend Collins kept the ceremony simple and heartfelt, speaking about partnership and mutual respect in marriage with a wisdom that suggested he understood exactly what kind of union Thomas and Eleanor were creating. When it came time for vows, Thomas surprised everyone by setting aside the traditional words the Reverend had prepared. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the small church, "I can't promise you poetry or fancy words, but I can promise you honesty, partnership, and a love that grows stronger every day. I promise to value your mind as much as your heart, to stand beside you in whatever challenges we face, and to build something with you that's better than anything either of us could create alone." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she responded with vows of her own, promising to be his equal partner in all things, to contribute her strength to their shared future, and to love the man he actually was rather than any fantasy she might have imagined. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas's kiss was gentle but sure, full of promise for their life together. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers that could probably be heard back at the ranch. The reception was held in the churchyard, with tables groaning under the weight of dishes contributed by nearly every family in the area. Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers, ranchers' wives who welcomed her with genuine warmth, and businessmen who clearly respected Thomas's judgment in choosing her as his partner. "Mrs. Mackenzie," said Doc Henderson, approaching with a warm smile, "I understand you have some interesting ideas about soil management. I'd love to discuss them sometime. My own property has some drainage issues that sound similar to what Thomas described." "I'd be delighted to help however I can," Eleanor replied, feeling a thrill at being addressed as an expert rather than just a pretty decoration. The afternoon passed in a blur of congratulations, laughter, and the kind of community celebration that made Eleanor understand why Thomas had chosen to make his life here. These people valued substance over style, practical ability over social graces, and they'd clearly decided that Thomas's bride possessed the qualities that mattered most on the frontier. The only shadow on the perfect day was James Whitfield, who remained notably cool throughout the festivities. Eleanor caught him watching her and Thomas with an expression that made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Her concerns proved justified when James approached them as the celebration was winding down, his usual charming facade replaced by something harder and more calculating. "Thomas," he said without preamble, "we need to discuss the future of our partnership. Recent developments have made it clear that our goals are no longer aligned." Thomas's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "What developments would those be, James?" "Your marriage changes everything," James said bluntly. "You'll be focused on domestic concerns now, less willing to take the kinds of risks that made our operation profitable. I think it's time we dissolved our partnership and went our separate ways." Eleanor felt Thomas tense beside her, and she realized that James was forcing a confrontation at the worst possible moment. In public, at their wedding reception, when any response Thomas made would be witnessed by the entire community. "That's quite an ultimatum to deliver at a man's wedding," Thomas said quietly, but Eleanor could hear the steel beneath the calm words. "It's a business decision," James replied. "Nothing personal. I'm prepared to buy out your share of the partnership at fair market value, or you can buy out mine. Either way, I think a clean break is best for everyone involved." Eleanor saw the trap immediately. James was counting on Thomas being too honorable to cause a scene at his own wedding, too concerned about community opinion to defend himself effectively. It was manipulation of the subtlest kind, designed to force Thomas into a disadvantageous position when he couldn't respond with full honesty. But James had underestimated both Thomas's integrity and Eleanor's understanding of business tactics. "Mr. Whitfield," Eleanor said smoothly, stepping slightly forward, "how considerate of you to bring this up today, when Thomas can't possibly give such an important matter the attention it deserves. I'm sure when you have time to reflect, you'll realize that wedding receptions aren't really appropriate venues for dissolving business partnerships." James's eyes narrowed as he realized she was calling out his strategy. "I simply thought it was better to be direct about my intentions." "Direct, certainly," Eleanor agreed with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Though I can't help wondering why you're so eager to end what Thomas tells me has been a very profitable arrangement. Unless, of course, you have other opportunities that require your full attention." The question was innocent enough on the surface, but Eleanor had noticed James's expensive clothes, his frequent trips to Denver, his general lifestyle that seemed to require more income than his partnership with Thomas could reasonably provide. She was suggesting, delicately but unmistakably, that his eagerness to dissolve the partnership might stem from financial pressures he hadn't disclosed. James flushed slightly, realizing that Eleanor was more perceptive than he'd expected. "My personal affairs are hardly relevant to this discussion." "Of course not," Eleanor said agreeably. "I'm sure Thomas will want to have his lawyer review the partnership agreement before making any decisions about dissolution. After all, such arrangements often contain clauses about notice periods, asset evaluations, that sort of thing. Very tedious, but so important to handle properly." Thomas was looking at his new wife with undisguised admiration, clearly recognizing that she just outmaneuvered James without breaking a sweat. "Eleanor's right," he said. "This isn't something to rush into. If you're serious about dissolving our partnership, James, we'll do it properly with lawyers and full documentation. But not today." James realized he'd lost control of the conversation and made one last attempt to regain the upper hand. "I hope you won't live to regret letting a woman handle your business affairs, Thomas. It's not usually a recipe for success." The insult to Eleanor was so blatant that several nearby guests turned to stare. Thomas stepped forward, his usually calm demeanor finally cracking. "James," he said, his voice carrying a warning that made everyone within earshot go quiet, "you will apologize to my wife immediately, or you will leave this reception. Those are your only options." The tension in the churchyard was palpable as the two men faced each other. James looked around at the faces watching him. Ranchers who respected Thomas, women who had welcomed Eleanor, community leaders who valued fairness and decency, and realized that he had badly miscalculated. "My apologies, Mrs. Mackenzie," he said stiffly. "That was inappropriate." Eleanor inclined her head graciously. "Apology accepted, Mr. Whitfield. I'm sure the stress of business concerns sometimes makes us say things we don't mean." As James retreated, clearly defeated, Eleanor felt Thomas's arm slip around her waist in a gesture of support and pride. "Have I mentioned that I married the most remarkable woman in the territory?" he murmured in her ear. "You may have mentioned it," Eleanor replied with a smile, "but I don't mind hearing it again." Later that evening, as they stood together on the porch of their ranch house, their home, watching the sun set over the mountains, Eleanor marveled at how completely her life had changed in just 1 week. "No regrets?" Thomas asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Only that I waited so long to find you," Eleanor replied, leaning into his solid warmth. "I never imagined I could be this happy." "Neither did I," Thomas admitted. "I thought contentment was the best I could hope for." "I never expected joy." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him, seeing her own wonder and gratitude reflected in his eyes. "We're going to build something amazing together, aren't we?" "The best partnership the Colorado Territory has ever seen," Thomas agreed, bending to kiss her forehead with infinite tenderness. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Eleanor realized that she'd found something infinitely more valuable than the romantic fantasy that had originally brought her west. She'd found a true partner, a man who valued her completely, and a love built on mutual respect and genuine affection. It wasn't the story she'd expected to write when she'd boarded that train in Chicago, but it was so much better than anything she could have imagined. And as Thomas led her inside their home to begin their married life together, Eleanor knew that their greatest adventures were just beginning. And so ends the remarkable tale of Eleanor and Thomas Mackenzie, a couple who discovered that the most beautiful love stories aren't always the ones that begin with poetry and passionate declarations, but rather with honesty, respect, and the courage to see each other clearly. What started as a deception, James Whitfield's borrowed words masquerading as Thomas's romantic soul, became the foundation for something infinitely more valuable. A marriage built on genuine partnership, mutual admiration, and the kind of deep understanding that comes from appreciating someone exactly as they are. Eleanor's journey from disappointed mail-order bride to respected ranch partner shows us that sometimes our greatest dreams come true in ways we never expected. She came west seeking a gentle poet but found something better, a strong, honest man who valued her intelligence as much as her beauty, who wanted her partnership as much as her love. Thomas's transformation from lonely bachelor to devoted husband reminds us that vulnerability and honesty are often more attractive than practiced charm. His willingness to confess his deception and reveal his true self proved more winning than any eloquent letter ever could have been. Their story celebrates the idea that real love isn't about finding someone who matches our fantasies, but about finding someone whose reality is even better than our dreams. Eleanor and Thomas built their marriage on shared goals, complementary strengths, and the unshakable foundation of seeing and accepting each other's authentic selves. Most importantly, their tale reminds us that the best partnerships are those where both people bring their whole selves, strengths and weaknesses, dreams and fears, practical skills and romantic hopes, to create something stronger together than either could achieve alone. If this story of unexpected love and genuine partnership touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of courage, romance, and second chances from America's frontier days. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever discovered that reality was better than your fantasies? What do you think makes a truly successful partnership? Remember, the most beautiful love stories often begin when two people decide to choose truth over fantasy, partnership over possession, and real understanding over romantic illusion. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the Wild West, where love always finds a way to surprise us.